Today, we're going to dig into the social phenomenon of the growing epidemic of friendships exploding among 20-somethings. We're digging into the psychology today. Here we go. It is extremely common and is becoming more so extremely common for 20-somethings to lose friends over the third decade of their life, friends from high school, college, and graduate school. And the sociological data bears this out, and we're going to look at that. And there are many phases to the unfolding of those friendships, at which the friendship could either stall or fade into insignificance or explode or implode. And not everybody experiences the loss of friends in the same way. So many people don't experience the explosive end of old friendships, and many people don't experience the slow disillusionment among friendships. But there is an increasing trend, especially among millennials entering into their 30s, of young people cutting so-called toxic people out of their lives. That's one of the pieces of rhetoric, or one of the ways of explaining these exploding friendships is being used. So that can be this cutting toxic people out of one's life, this trope, this cliche as it's becoming. This can be used as a tool for great good or for great sanctimonious harm. And either way, I want to understand the archetypal saga, okay, the universal and timeless drama that undergirds and frames how and why millennial friendships are beginning to end more frequently and more violently. And the way that I see it, and the way I piece together the sociological and the psychological data, are that the common millennial coming-of-age tale takes place in 8 acts, okay? And this 8-act tale, which could just as easily be a comedy or a drama as a tragedy, is a version of the hero's journey, which is not as simple as venturing out of the home and facing a dragon and returning home. Increasingly, millennials are self-consciously shaping their lives by tailoring their friendships, cutting out toxic people, going to therapy, and geographically relocating at a rate which both isolates them relationally and hypersaturates them socially and psychologically. So you've got this weird imbalance. So the hero never comes home. The hero never returns back to his place of origin with new knowledge and with new powers. The hero's journey never completes itself because it never comes full circle, because the ends begin to fray. The pieces of the story don't come to conclusion, essentially. So anyway, enough yammering about Campbellian archetypes. The product of all of this is that instead of having 10 tribes of people with common traditions and stories and values that compete with one another and fight against one another, you have every man for himself and every woman for herself, building his own traditions and shaping his own values and reinventing the wheel in a way that creates more heat than light. And when you have 1 million quickly evolving individuals instead of 10 slow-moving groups that are situated in a particular tradition, the possibility for meaning and connection and combustion grows exponentially. And the consequences take place for each individual outside a framework of social support, and can therefore make these experiences, particularly these combustive relational experiences, all the more devastating, and recovery all the more difficult. So we're in a dubious relational and psychological and archetypal situation, each of us. So here is, in my estimation, how 20-somethings lose friends, or how millennial friendships explode in 8 acts. Act 1 is bonding season, okay? Act 1 occurs at school or camp or at a retreat, and it is a sacred bonding moment in which a group experiences something meaningful and then sanctifies itself from the world and organizes itself around a series of jokes or late night talks or vulnerable disclosures or religious confessions, okay? And on the basis of these experiences, young adults in their late adolescence and their early adulthood will, often without even thinking, constitute these micro-governmental populations that migrate back from the mountaintop experience into the desert of daily life, back into the humdrum of quotidian life, okay? And Kirsty Gover, who is a senior lecturer at Melbourne Law School, calls in her Oxford University Press monograph she calls this tribal constitutionalism, okay? And she's using it to talk about something else, but the idea applies here, which is that the initial phases of in-group formation are very informal, but they are also very strict, okay? In 21st century America, we don't think much about tribal belonging, but in its place have come two principles which serve the same purpose. One is very abstract and formal, one is more informal, okay? And the abstract and formal category, and it's very real and concrete, of course, but this more formal abstract category is like, for example, United States citizenship or national identity, okay? And the other is a very intimate and informal, which we'll call like best friends, right? Or like friend groups, okay? Or cliques. And the rules of belonging in the clique can sometimes be formalized in everything from the Boy Scouts to something even a little bit more on the informal side of the spectrum, like the Little Rascals or something like that, right? But the rules of belonging to an in-group are very often more what John Burroughs, who's a law professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, what he calls practice derives indigenous citizenship. Okay, so every friend group has its own informal practices or practice-derived rules or rituals of indigeneity. Okay, and so these practices are mostly and commonly informal, but they usually codify some artifact or relic from the birthplace of the group, from the mountaintop experience which gave birth to the group, and that becomes a central practice within that particular group. So it could be church attendance, or if it was a religious retreat or Bible study, or it could be a joke or a secret or a game or a ritual or a common goal. It could be an athletic performance, right? Or it could be training, and around this common central sacred practice will include rituals of belonging within the group, which the group will perform these rituals, these sacred rituals together for the sake of demonstrating belonging, okay? So sociologists often distinguish between these two, ways that people form groups. They call it the mechanical and the organic. So Emil Durkheim, if you know anything about sociology, an infamous sociologist, sort of popularized this distinction between the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft, okay? And literally translated, those words mean community and society. But Max Weber appropriated them as tools to highlight the formal association of citizenship, the Gesellschaft, in opposition to the subjective, affective, emotional bond that occurs relationally between individuals, the Gemeinschaft. And that's what I'm saying is that these two principles which play themselves out, which we have called, exemplified before as United States citizenship, which is the Gesellschaft, right? And then more friend groups or cliques or best friends or some of those informal associations are the Gemeinschaft. And that's, sociology recognizes these two principles playing themselves out. And we're looking more at the Gemeinschaft and why these sorts of affective, subjective, emotional bonds not only dissolve, but combust. Okay, so that's Act 1. That's how these groups are formed ritually and with a sense of sanctity. There's almost a religious quality to the formation of each and every single friend group. Okay, so Act 2. Okay, so Act 1 was a bonding season. Act 2 is geographical relocation. So many 20-somethings are confused about the cause of their loneliness and their friendlessness, in their third decade, but have never really counted the cost of geographical relocation, which is more and more common. And it's not bad to leave the nest, but it is costly, and we often don't count that cost existentially and financially, right? This is a fairly recent sociological trend for young adults to just leave where they're from, right? But now it's sort of commonplace, right? 20-something student culture, especially, in which most university students are displaced from their families and social support groups and reforge sacred bonds and rituals and become members of communities which are constituted primarily by immature and emerging and morally unformed university student peers, right? And they are cultivating a culture of arrested development and even regressive maturation because of a transition from a traditional community, which is their familial upbringing, to a nomadic life, where they go from home to university, to an internship, to a job, to a camp, and now they don't live at home anymore. And who are they? And where are they? And where are they from? And what are their traditions? And what have they taken with them? It's not formal. The transition requires effort because it's not formal. Okay? There's a sociologist named Shanti Robertson at Western Sydney University, and she calls this the regression of students from traditional modalities of psychological development that we've been talking about in their adolescence, right? Being raised by their parents in traditions. The transition from that traditional raising in adolescence to the nomadic modalities of university culture in their 20s. Robertson calls these translocal subjectivities. And speaking about this transition to a translocal subjectivity, a translocal phenomenology, a geographically mobile phenomenon or subjective experience or mindset, is a way of locating the psychological cost of chronic geographical relocation. And a recent geographical study, actually from the University of Southampton, speaks about geographical mobility as sort of a furthering dialogue about this notion of translocal subjectivities. Speaks about how geographical mobility gives birth to an existential vertigo due to the rapid reconfiguration of the constellation of relationships that constitute one's sense of self and one's sense of belonging and one's sense of meaning, right? So that your whole map and your whole fixed sense of being able to orient yourself and having a reference point for who you are is moving, and the ground underneath your very subjective existence is shifting. And it's difficult to have a sense of one's essence, a sense of oneself. And one of the primary ways that this existential vertigo is brought about is through geographical mobility. Or another way to put it is that the cost of geographical mobility, the cost of entering into a translocal subjectivity by transitioning from a fixed traditional adolescent state to a chronically mobile 20-something state, is this existential vertigo, is a loss of self. So, Act 1, bonding season of the group. Act 2, geographical relocation. Oh, great, we're all together. We bonded at the university, but guess what? We've graduated. Okay? Act 3, redoubling of loyalty. So, when this geographical relocation occurs among the members of a social group, most commonly due to the graduation of its members from the venue which gave rise to its existence, this graduation increases the energetic tax required to maintain the social capital of the group. Okay? So often, departure from the phase of occupying the same space, okay? Departure from that occupation of the similar place that you are in, a dormitory or a college or a university or a high school or a camp or a retreat or whatever, that is eased by the delusion that such geographical departure will have only a minor effect on the intimacy of the relationships. And one way that this delusion that the geographical departure, well, it won't really affect our relationships that much. One way that this delusion is maintained is that the group members will begin to exaggerate their gestures of belonging in order to overcompensate for or overcome the strain that geographical distance places on the group's relational potency. Okay, so in the same way that geographical mobility can place a strain on one's existential identity, it can also place a strain on a social identity of a friend group. Okay, and common rituals, which before required a minimal effort, are now become reified and now begin to overpopulate the practices of the group. And the central sacred practices of the group often increase in frequency. And the group will take on properties typical of a migrant nomadic religious community, primarily as an annual Mecca, right? To a particular place, an annual retreat or quest to a similar place to relive or to recapitulate the same placeness that they once had, that they once populated, that they once enjoyed. right? So common trips to the coffee shop that might have occurred in the original bonding phase of the group are replaced with like road trips and retreats and expensive visits and long letters and even longer phone calls and expressions of devotion and intimacy and I love you, man, which maybe that would have been awkward before. But now, in this geographical dispersion of the group, for the sake of the group's survival, these over-dramatic and over-exaggerated gestures become necessary to the survival of the group. Okay? So, Act 1, bonding season. Act 2, geographical relocation. Act 3, a redoubling of loyalty. Act 4, progressive differentiation of values and life visions. Act 4, progressive differentiation of values and life visions. So I'm actually going to read a quote to you from the infamous psychologist Carl Jung at length. Okay. He says, quote, this is Carl Jung, quote, "We are all familiar with the sources of the problems that arise in the period of youth. For most people, it is the demands of life which harshly put an end to the dream of childhood. If the individual is sufficiently well prepared, the transition to a profession or career can take place smoothly. But if he clings to illusions that are contrary to reality, then problems will surely arise. No one can take this step into life without making certain assumptions, and occasionally these assumptions are false. That is, they do not fit the conditions into which one is thrown. Often it is a question of exaggerated expectations, underestimation of difficulties, unjustified optimism, or a negative attitude. One could compile quite a list of the false assumptions that give rise to the first conscious problems. But it is not always the contradiction between subjective assumptions and external facts that give rise to problems. It may just as often be inner psychic difficulties. They may exist even when things run smoothly in the outside world. Very often, it is the disturbance of psychic equilibrium caused by the sexual instinct. Equally often, it is the feeling of inferiority which springs from an unbearable sensitivity. These inner conflicts may exist even when adaptation to the outer world has been achieved without apparent effort. It even seems as if young people who have had a hard struggle for existence are spared inner problems, while those who for some reason or other have no difficulty with adaptation run into problems of sex or conflicts arising from a sense of superiority. What Jung is talking about, this internal psychic conflict that blows the ship of personal identity in very different directions for each person, depending on their access to financial capital, their psychological constitution, their attachment style, even their religious convictions. Okay? While previously each group member would have been able to sort of track the other members of the group in real time based on daily contact, the geographical dispersion makes every point of contact between each group member more and more violent as they fail to bear daily witness to the events which shape and direct each person's life. So when they talk and they hear somebody talking, well, we haven't talked in a month, and wow, well, you're making assumptions I would never make. Now, group member A and group member B will express their opinions to one another about the direction of group member C. How sort of traitorous and irrational or psychopathic it is for member C to value or choose or profess or change the way that they have. And this sense of metaphysical and divine solidarity within the group, it will be strained by this confusion and require an impossible amount of empathy and loyalty and charity from every single group member for every single other group member. One meta-analysis conducted by researchers from the University of Central Florida and Hofstra University found that group cohesion is stronger when that cohesion is constantly tested and applied to a particular performance-oriented task, okay? So in the absence of such a task, or in the absence of a sense of meaningfulness about that task, cohesion atrophies. So in the absence of those tasks, there is an increased psychological strain on each member to maintain group cohesion. And yet, the relational muscles which bear this increasing strain become weaker and weaker because contact is not as frequent. Okay, so this strain will increase gradually, bringing the group's identity slowly to an informal and unspoken disillusion through the entropy of time. Or it will bring it to an explosive and devastating end to this group, which damages and morally injures each member of the group. We should also note one factor, which is almost never really investigated, which is the role of jealousy as relationships age. And this is one more sort of part of this Act 4, this progressive differentiation of values and life visions. Okay, and we could really call it a differentiation or disparity of success, which puts strain on the peerness of the group. Okay, so if one person advances in physical prowess or body physique aesthetic or financial status or social status or marital status or familial status at a rate faster than the rest, well, this can become a big factor in breeding resentment on one person's side. So one thing that commonly bonds groups is that they are peers. So if one member begins to ascend the hierarchy so quickly and with such ease that his group's co-members are no longer actually his peers, well, this will inevitably be a source of relational strain and will yield catastrophe in its season unless the group has values or bonding principles which can mitigate and process a vast competitive disparity, or unless it can accommodate the transition of one member's role from that of a peer to a mentor. Okay, so that's another aspect of strain, that as people age, especially throughout their 20s, the despair. I mean, during your 20s is one of the decades of your life where disparity between your peers will change most rapidly. Okay, so now we've had four acts so far. Act 1, the bonding season. Act 2, geographical relocation. Act 3, redoubling of loyalty to accommodate for geographical relocation. Act 4, progressive differentiation of values and life visions. Act 5, an explosive end to the relationship. So, researchers at the University of Texas at Austin published a study in the journal Evolution and Human Behavior, in which they studied how children used ritual as a formal way of mitigating membership in their in-group, and that children who were unable to play the game of an in-group's idiosyncratic practices or their sacred rites of sanctity, children who were unable or were unwilling to play that game were stripped of their membership. And renowned social philosopher René Girard explains this phenomenon and how it works psychologically and anthropologically in his infamous work called Violence and the Sacred. And he expounds on this notion of the exile of the individual, scapegoating, which becomes another sacred rite that the community practices as it matures, that it not only ostracizes the scapegoat, but refortifies the relational bonds that constitute the existing community. So this is where the very existence of the community or friendship or clique or tribe is viewed in terms of its origins as truly and properly an act of sanctification, of setting itself apart from the world. So Girard comments. The birth of the community is first and foremost an act of separation. This is why metaphors of severance permeate generation. Modern thinkers view the sacred solely as a mediating force because they try to interpret primitive reality in terms of a religion that has been purged of its maleficent qualities. But any mingling of the community and the sacred, whether due to the intervention of the gods or mythic heroes or the dead, produces exclusively maleficent results. Every supernatural visitation is prompted by the spirit of revenge. Benefits accrue only after the divinity has departed. This is why the rationale for expatriating a single member regularly makes appeal to sacred language. Okay, so when you're exiling somebody from a group, that will often take place with very sanctimonious language. Okay, so the expression of outrage that disrupts the bonds of intimacy is usually saturated in religious language such as violation and sanctity and sacredness and right versus wrong. And this is most common in friendships, I think, which lack or have become functionally disattached from the Christian bonds of belief, or which has become is no longer binded by Christian principles explicitly. So a close friend of mine recently took a sort of male bonding trip with his buddies. And while they were on the trip, there was a bonding, a redoubling of loyalty, or repeating old inside jokes, running through the gambit of bonding rituals, that bonded them, kicking the tires of their friend group's sanctity, testing its concreteness, its existence. And then there came a moment on the last night of the trip that 3 of the guys violently confronted my friend, okay? And they teased him and called him names and started listing all the things that they didn't like about him, and started reading him the riot act about ways that he had wronged them. Now, this guy is my close friend, and he was recounting this situation to me, and I could see him welling up with tears, okay? I mean, this is a big guy. He's a strong man. He's a tough guy. And you could see the injury in his soul, and you could see his blindness to the way that he'd been wronged. But there were deeper Girardian realities at work that I could clearly see from the outside. So I kind of told him my perspective in this situation. And the 4 of them had gone to a Christian school together, a Christian liberal arts school, and they had sort of stayed friends throughout the years. And over the years, he was the only one who actually remained a Christian, who practiced monogamy, who remained celibate until marriage, and remained, an Orthodox Christian. So of the other 3 men, 2 of them had lost their families because they cheated on their wife. And 2 of them had left Christianity entirely. And 1 was a practicing homosexual who had left Christianity. So in this situation, because the sanctity of the tribe was not governed by deeper Christian principles that had been time-tested to sort of mediate a moral grievance and to dispense grace and to encourage temperance and forgiveness, this person's friend group mimicked more primitive and pagan methods of dealing with moral injury in the camp. So sort of these Girardian tropes, right? Scapegoating without grace and mob-ruled moral sanctimony that can only be consistently cultivated in one's public self outside the context of Christian belief and community. And in this sense, sort of the explosive end to this group was actually a way of avoiding the group's dissolution. So this is increasingly common among 20-something friendships. Groups will implode and scapegoat a single individual under the guise of the sanctity of the group. And that exile becomes the new sacred origin of Group 2.0, which is now either smaller or has replaced the exiled member with a new or more fitting member whose values cohere with the group and whose price of entry is a belief that the scapegoating was appropriate. So the new relational fervor of this group is synthesized and set into motion by the moral outrage against the exiled member. And that member is sent into the wilderness to bear the destruction that the group would have faced if he had stayed. So, that is simply an example of the principle I'm talking about. One commonly overlooked factor, I think, that can drastically increase, and let me just say, the reason that this explosion occurs is because in the phase in which financial disparity and competitive disparity and value disparity grows, right? Act 4, when all of this disparity and differentiation occurs among members of the group due to their geographical disparity, well, those bonds are not dealt with. And the differentiation which occurs, the group or the sanctity of the group the group must either take the hit of that disparity as a group, or it must funnel and channel and potentize that disparity and blame it on a single person, and then that person has to go, and the group is refortified and re-sanctified around the religious act of excommunication. Okay, and one, I wanted to sort of touch on one communicative aspect of this process, which I think expedites the scapegoating act. And one commonly overlooked factor that can really drastically increase the likelihood of an explosive, violent end to a friendship is the technologization of communication. So relational conflict is expedited and reconciliation is impeded and occluded by the technological textual medium of arbitration. What do I mean by this? Well, there's a psychological law behind this, and the absence of bodily presence in communication allows each side, or allows the out group, to reduce their interlocutor, or the potential scapegoatee to an opponent, to reduce their opponent to a meme, and therefore to reduce their friend to an enemy. In other words, attempts to resolve serious grievances through a textual or technological medium are statistically guaranteed to fail. And resolution attempts which insist on face-to-face resolution, which are optimal, or even a phone conversation, which is less optimal, have the best chance of success, okay? And conflict resolution, which takes place over email, text, or messenger, is more likely to fail the more serious conflict resolution agenda. If one person refuses to speak in person or over the phone, they are already insisting on a version of the conversation which favors the destruction of the relationship and the exile of the member. So far, we've gone through 5 acts, okay? These 5 acts are: Act 1, a bonding season. Act 2, geographical relocation. Act 3, a redoubling of loyalty. Act 4, progressive differentiation of values and life visions. Act 5, an explosive end to the relationship. Act 6, loneliness, grief, guilt, self-condemnation, self-righteousness, anger. Okay, there's really no good name for Act 6. A bunch of conflicting emotions, okay? So losing friends is always painful, but it is hardly more painful than when you lose good friends because you are so maligned and mistreated and vilified that you are compelled out of self-care to expatriate yourself from the people that you love, while they are under the impression that you are doubly guilty of both the original grievance and abandoning and forsaking the relationship. It'll be helpful again here, especially in our modern day, to revisit the wisdom of Carl Jung once again. So, reading this quote from Jung, Jung says, quote, "People whose own temperaments offer problems are often neurotic, but it would be a serious misunderstanding to confuse the existence of problems with neurosis. There is a marked difference between the two in that the neurotic is ill because he is unconscious of his problems, while the person with a difficult temperament suffers from his conscious problems without being ill." Wow, this is packed. I have to read this again. No, I'm not going to read it again. You got it. You can rewind if you need to read it again. I already know what I think about it. So basically, it comes to this issue of gaslighting, and gaslighting is a very overused concept here. But we're going to highlight it its very possibility and the role that it must play in the scapegoating of an individual in the 21st century, in which moral sanctimony is really central to the process of scapegoating. So, friends will gaslight you by taking advantage of this Jungian distinction between conscious and unconscious ill. They will claim to see something that you can't. Yes, I'm telling you your problems. Yes. Like children who point and laugh at another child for some fabricated notion. You know, the mocked child has no epistemological access to his own deficiency, and he must therefore either self-exile from the group or submit to the dominance play of the challenging child, of the mocking children. So the assertion of moral perception and psychological insight into another person's mind, okay, and that assertion of moral perception and superiority by in-group members will use this Jungian concept of neurosis as a tool to create a sacred hierarchy within the group, in which their ethical authority and their psychological insight and even their therapeutic insight is unquestionable on the basis of some constructed expertise. In our day, increasingly, and we'll get to this a little bit more in a second, this sacred knowledge is often an expertise in sniffing out a psychopathology, which is both absurd and heinous abuse of this concept by any person in their 20s. Okay? And again, we're going to talk about this more in a second. But yet, the perception of psychopathology in an in-group rival is a common tactic used to establish dominance. Man, you're crazy. You're evil. You know what? I love you, but you're psycho. And often the two are inflated. Psychopathology and moral deficiency. You're so evil, you can't even see how crazy you are. Or you're so blinded by your psychopathology or your past or your issues, you can't even see how bad you're acting. They will epistemologically posture over you. Now, this allows us to raise sort of an informal point about the overuse of psychological authority by 20-somethings in the 21st century. It is just ridiculous, okay? There is no more common means of excommunicating a group member than by psychologizing their reasons for exile or unbelonging. You know what your problem is? Let me tell you what your problem is. I mean, every freaking body is Sigmund Freud today. I mean, everybody is a therapist. You know, you get a long email or text or rant about exactly what your problem is, and that is the most common form of documentation people receive for social eviction. And it's important to note 3 points about this, okay? Number one, most people are not qualified to make these psychological assessments. It is simply absurd. It is ridiculous. It is delusive, okay? Your friends, least of all, okay? So I'll make this point that your friends are biased by their friendship with you and are therefore disqualified to make psychological evaluations of you, okay? This is called in psychology a dual relationship. In the counseling world, if you have a dual relationship, it is an undesirable therapeutic situation because it damages the therapist's credibility in most cases because they have an interest in reading you or analyzing you a certain way. Or they're blinded by their experiences of you rather than being guided by their expertise. Okay, so number one, your friends are the least qualified people to make these assessments of you because they're your friends. Number two, they are also likely not qualified to make these psychological assessments of you because they are not licensed psychologists. Okay, and I want to make a distinction because even we have psychology is the most common bachelor degree major in America. And everybody thinks that the profession, the mental health profession, is growing very rapidly, and many people are actually becoming licensed counselors. Okay, but people have to realize that I've been studying psychology, or I'm in my second year of studying psychology in my master's or my bachelor's. That doesn't mean you're a licensed counselor, and I'll even go this far. Even if you are a licensed counselor, this is not the same thing as being a psychotherapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Not even freaking close. Okay? Being a licensed counselor requires like 2,000 hours, I think, of clinical work and a master's degree. Being a licensed psychologist requires 6,000 hours of clinical work and your master's, not your master's, but it requires your PhD, which means a doctoral dissertation. It literally requires at least 3 times as much work to become a psychologist. So somebody says, "Ooh, I'm a mental health professional." Really? What are you? Because literally, like being a licensed counselor in the world of psychology is like being a minor league baseball player in the realm of professional sports. Okay? Being a licensed counselor does not require a doctorate. Okay, especially if they're MFT. If they're LPC, that's better. But if they're just MFT, not as legit. Just going to say it, not as legit. And many practicing psychotherapists, or I should say rather, many practicing counselors have an overinflated sense of confidence about their diagnostic ability, especially young 20-something therapists. They are like children putting on their mother's makeup. Okay, it's cute, but anyone who knows what they're doing, especially people with their doctorate in clinical psychology, they will know that that most psychological analysis offered by 20-somethings, it's not what they call in the profession, it's not case-wise. Meaning, you've been doing this for how long? A year? Okay, not enough. Not enough. Meaning they do not bear the marks of experience or humility that inevitably comes from the history of clinical success and failure and doctoral level study in the discipline and in their clinical practice. Okay. Number 3, it is morally wrong to weaponize psychological issues against another person. Okay. A mature, moral person will not make a moral stance based on their psychological hot take on your mental health. And if you find yourself being analyzed and you're looking down the barrel of someone else's take on your psychological issues as they gun you down, remember, that is an abusive and harmful and maladaptive use of psychological analysis, and it says far more about their state of immaturity, I should say, and especially about their moral bankruptcy than anything they could possibly have to say about you. Act 7. ownership of self and new values. Okay, that's the next act. So you go from act 5, which was being expelled, to act 6, which is loneliness, to act 7, which is now, you know what? I'm owning who I really am, which maybe got me exiled from this group. Okay, so psychological dysfunctions and character immaturities, which may have complemented one another in a group's early 20s, may become toxically incompatible in their more mature and sophisticated manifestations. So, for example, codependence might work really well for 2 displaced boys in their late teens, but will later serve as the unbreakable bedrock of contentious rivalry in their late 20s. Okay. So British sociologist Ray Paul, who's an elected fellow of the British Academy, found in his meta-analysis of studies on friendship that women are more interested in friendships that offer emotional loyalty, whereas men tend to bond over practical commonalities. So what import does this have? Well, just roll with me for a second. Len Jameson, who is professor of sociology at Edinburgh, she explains something, and I want to read a quote by her. She explains this. The ideal of quote-unquote pure relationship does not allow for messy and asymmetrical periods of needing practical help or feeling dependent or needy, which are routine occurrences in parent-child relationships, partnerships, and some friendships. The circumstances of many people's lives render pure friendships both difficult and insufficient, end quote. So what's the takeaway of this? The takeaway is this. As you recalibrate your own identity, as the salience of your former in-group begins to fade, you will find a greater sense of autonomy and consequently a greater tolerance for flexibility and expectation of reciprocated autonomy in future relationships. So, in other words, after your codependent relationships collapse under the weight of their own pagan toxicity, you have the opportunity to become a more self-reliant and flexible person who is attracted to more self-reliant and flexible people. Okay? And you will find that in the wake of exile or in the wake of an exploded best friendship, you actually have an opportunity to feel comfortable in your own values in a way that before maybe you hadn't, or maybe when you originally became friends, you didn't even have those values. Okay? So when close friends who were judgmental of your core values functionally remove themselves from your life or force you to remove them from their life, then you can stop apologizing for your vision for life and the values that undergird that vision. You're not constantly having to defend your principles to somebody with whom you have a bond that is basically pagan. Okay, I actually recently had a small scale version of this. Well, this isn't even really what I'm talking about, but I had a small scale version of this recently. I've spent the past 5 years studying trauma, and that world of trauma research is like 99% politically left leaning. But at the same time, the main theologian who was overseeing my doctorate was a classical fundamentalist evangelical Christian, brilliant theologian. But because I was doing my PhD in religious trauma, I had a therapist or 2 therapists and a theologian on my doctoral committee. So at the same time, I had very left-leaning interests overseeing my research, and also very right-leaning interests overseeing my research. And only after graduating with my PhD did I feel like I could publicly articulate my own view. Only after I was sort of formally free from those bonds could I publicly sort of articulate my own view and write the sort of scholarship that was really true to the way I saw the world, without fearing sort of the wrath of leftist Christians on the one hand, or the judgment of fundamentalist closed-mindedness on the other hand. So that's Act 7, is taking ownership of the self. And Act 8 is having a new community with your new values, building new friendships, okay? Building a new friend group. And after you have confidently identified yourself with your values that are really true to who you are and what you really believe, then you can associate with a community that shares those values, okay? And ideally, you will and this is very common. People come out of these toxic relationships and they only have anti-values, right? So ideally you will have more than just anti-values, okay? So if you leave a religious group and your only value left is atheism, I mean, that's not really a value. It's not really a principle. That's most likely going to quickly turn into bitterness and anger. I'm not saying you have to be listen, I'm not trying to make a religious case here. I'm just trying to say when you leave a group, it's better to have principles on which you're building your new life that are more than just anti that group, right? So successful, a successful 20-something will emerge out of those old friendships with a positive principle on which to build their lives. So family, church, community, children, virtue, education, skill, craftsmanship, community service. As Jordan Peterson says, identify the highest conceivable good and orient yourself toward it. So kind of winding down a little bit, it's important to recognize this 8-act play and how it could easily, for many people be a 3-act play. What I mean by this is that people can get stuck in groups, stagnated in toxic ways of thinking, or trapped by the bitterness and loneliness of exile. And the 8-act version of this story is the most difficult to manifest. And I'm going to sort of walk us through all 8 of these in a very, very short amount of time. That's Act 1, bonding season for the group, right? Act 2, geographical dispersion of the group. Act 3, redoubling of loyalty in light of geographical dispersion. Act 4, progressive differentiation of values and life visions, right? But you're becoming different and becoming better and you're becoming worse. Act 5, an explosive end to the community or the relationship, or a Girardian exile. Act 6, loneliness and anger and grief and self-condemnation and self-righteousness. Act 7, ownership of new self and new values. Act 8, a new community with new values. Okay? So this 8-act version of the story is the most difficult to manifest because it requires that you actually run the whole gamut. It requires that you essentially go through the whole version of this newly formatted hero's journey, right? It requires the most bravery to bring into being, because it requires the most ownership and responsibility and creativity to bring it about. But the most successful 20-somethings with the most satisfying friendships are the ones who have moved beyond the paganism of ritualistic friend groups and fortified a meaningful Christian principle on which they have built themselves and toward which they have oriented themselves and therefore their friendships and their relationships and their families. Okay, so 20-somethings who fail to do this, they will run into a brick wall at age 35 or at age 40. I mean, they will. You see it constantly. Okay, you see these people. They will find themselves. I'm not being judgmental. Like I'm just trying to live my best life. You know what I'm saying? But what I'm really trying to say is, just look at these people. Okay, they will find themselves uninspired and stagnated and depressed and unmotivated because the sacrament of nostalgia will have run its course and drained them of all meaning. And that's why most college-born friend groups who retain their social fervor end up at dive bars, 70 pounds overweight by their mid-30s. That's not good. It's no bueno, okay? Don't let yourself fall into that trap. That doesn't mean you have to isolate yourself from everyone with a, sanctimonious sense of your own religious self-importance. But it does mean 2 things. First, it means that you are finding yourself, if you're finding yourself losing more friends than you thought you would lose in your late 20s, don't immediately judge yourself, okay? You may be on the right path. Use it as a metric, okay? As a way of asking yourself, like, where am I headed, okay? And do I like where I'm going? And do I like where are they headed? Do I like where they're going? Okay, so if you're finding yourself losing more friends than you thought, don't necessarily take that as diagnostic that you're on the wrong path. You may be on the exact right path. Second, don't let yourself be satisfied with the paganism of tribal constitutionalism. If that's all your friendships are, do better, okay? Seek to build something deeper. And I'm not saying this is easy. This is hard, okay? The joy of fellowship and the satisfaction of fellowship is so much sweeter when you're common travelers on a road, okay? When you each share common elements of your mission, of your personal mission. Or even better, when you have the same mission, seeking the same virtues, building the same character traits, implementing the same habits, fighting the same vices and temptations, seeking strength from the same sources. Those are the most satisfying types of meaningful friend groups, okay? And the only way to find yourself in those friend groups is to know for yourself what your values are, what your principles are, what your goals are. You must find that for yourself first. And a friend group that requires loyalty to the group above all is a group that is pagan and not worth being in, because one day you will find yourself as a scapegoat. Don't let lost friendships that needed to be lost devastate you. And let every lost friendship be a lesson, not of something negative to avoid or as a reason to be pessimistic, but let every lost friendship be a lesson of something positive to seek. Let it be a lesson about yourself, for yourself. And let it be a lesson for implementing something positive above yourself in every single friendship that you have and every single friendship that you'll cultivate in the future.